Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For those of you who follow my channel, you know I don't put out content every week or something like that. I normally only put out content when I am inspired by something. Something strikes a nerve with me, or I think something would be beneficial to touch on. I received two phone calls, or had two conversations with two different brothers, and we talked about a few different topics. One topic that we talked about, I'm going to touch on at the end, I think. The other one was a brother who called me. We studied together in Egypt, or we were in Egypt at the same time. He is far more advanced than me in his Islamic studies, so I always appreciate his insight and his information, in reference to Islam. He's a good brother. He's a Bosnian brother. We talked about systemic oppression, and we talked about, or he asked the question, or he actually made a statement that systemic oppression in the South is more prevalent or prominent, or impacts more in the South than it does in the North. And we also talked about education. When we talked about education, I've been doing, quite a bit of reading lately on AI and the effect of AI. Most of everything that I read or that I research, I look at what is the impact on African American community and the African American Muslim community. How does this topic impact minorities, or what we consider to be minorities in America? Again, specifically African Americans and or African American Muslims. When we look at AI, we have to understand, or we have to have a longitudinal view of what AI is going to be. We have to look at what it is now, and then sort of have an idea or think about what it's going to be on down the road and how it is going to affect us. Oftentimes I hear people downplay education. College isn't important. College is not needed. College is a waste of money. And I am absolutely, unequivocally disagree with that. Just as a side note, I was talking to a guy just this past week, and he's a job developer. He's a government job developer. And he told me that he had a client who was a veteran, who had gotten in early on the ground floor of IT. He had progressed to the level of executive director. So he went from the bottom level up to, executive directors of something to do with IT in the company. So what happened was they ended up laying him off and replacing him with a college graduate that they could pay half of what he was making. Now, he was making $165,000 a year, and they replaced him with a college grad for half of that. Now, half of that, come on, half of that is not what the average American is making anyway. So, the next thing I know to come out of someone's mouth is, well, yeah, that college graduate is making less. Yes, but he's making more than the national average by far. So he's still doing good. Also, research has shown, you can go to Pew Research and look at it, college graduates on average make more short-term and long-term over non-graduates. With that being said, enter technology, AI. AI is going to replace many what we consider to be low-income jobs. So we're talking about your food service workers. We're talking about your cashiers. It's going to affect even truck drivers. And truck drivers make a good living. It's going to replace truck drivers at some point. It's going to replace delivery drivers at some point. It's coming, and they're working on it. Think about these self-driving cars. Now, you eliminate an entire demographic, low-wage workers. You eliminate an entire demographic of people, and they are not able to really sustain themselves at the level that they once were, because they've been replaced by robots, they've been replaced by automated systems. What comes after these people are eliminated? What comes after that? The answer is crime. Crime is going to come after that, because one way or the other, people are going to eat. One way or the other, people are going to feed their families and clothe and shelter and take care of the necessities for their families. So crime is going to rise, because demographics, groups of people are going to be eliminated from the workforce and not be able to sustain themselves. Something has to give one way or the other. That's one thing. The other thing is, when I explained to him, this leads into the systemic oppression conversation that we had, and he was under the impression that systemic racism or systemic oppression would be less in the North than it is in the South. And I said, then no, that's not the case. And I had to explain to my brother how institutions work together in conjunction, in collaboration, to produce uneven outcomes in the society and maintain the status quo, be it North or South. And these institutions that come together make up the system. The system is the umbrella, and the institutions that work together make up the system. As an example, when we look at redlining, right? Redlining was the process of relegating black people to ghettos and slums, separating them, segregating them into certain areas. So you would walk into a bank, on the wall would be a map. Areas where black people were concentrated would be a red circle or a red line around the area where they lived. Realtors, which is another industry that is historically racist, realty and banking, they would work together. The realtor would not show homes to black people who may have had the money to move either out of the ghetto. They had money to move out, to move into a different area. They would not be shown homes. They would maybe be taken to another area that was black, or black people who had the money to move into a better neighborhood, they were corralled and herded into the ghetto. So the realtor industry and the banking industry work together to maintain the status quo. So again, the realty game is not free from racism. And I know there's some brothers that are so hype on realty, and realty is all well and good, but it's not free from the history of systemic oppression. When I said industries, or institutions rather, work together to produce uneven outcomes. And this goes into the conversation that I had with the other brother. Racism in America, systemic oppression, doesn't really lessen. But the application of it, how it's applied, morphs and changes to fit the time and era that we happen to be in. in the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, she points this out. And I would, tell anybody in a minute, read that book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness by Michelle Alexander, former law professor at the Ohio State University. But in her book, she talks about how racism, again, doesn't really lessen, or it's not being eliminated, but it simply changes form. It's amorphous. It changes form to fit the time and era that we're in. So she covered from slavery. From slavery, she went to the black codes and black laws and the convict leasing program, which I'm not going to get into all of that. From the convict leasing program and black codes and black laws, she went to Jim Crow era. From the Jim Crow era, we went into mass incarceration, which affected primarily African Americans, right? We were the ones who took the biggest hit. African Americans and Hispanics, but mainly African Americans. We took the biggest hit on the mass incarceration, stop and frisk in New York, disproportionate policing in our neighborhoods, militarized policing in our neighborhoods, uneven and unjust sentencing between blacks and whites for the same crime. Everything hit us harder than it hit everybody else. And I would argue that. Well, what era are we in now? We're not in slavery per se. We're not in the black codes and black laws time. We're not in Jim Crow anymore. Mass incarceration is being pulled back, meaning many African American men who were locked in prison for low-level drug crimes. Many of them marijuana, which is now legal in many states. And I understand that there is a push to legislate. Oh, also everything that I named, from slavery to black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow, massacre, were all legal. They were all legalized. It was all legal by law. They could do these things. Again, systemic oppression. Legalized, normalized. Many of these low-level drug offenders are being let out of prison now, right? They're being let out of the walls of the penitentiary, right? But are they being let out of prison? Now, I just said they're being let out of prison. Then I turned right around and said, but are they being let out of prison? You thought I made a mistake. I didn't. There's a new form of incarceration on the horizon. And it's not new, but it is greatly being increased and utilized. It's called e-carceration. What is e-carceration? For those brothers that have ever been locked up, you may know it as being put on the box. Have you ever seen someone who's let out of prison, or they're on parole, or they're on probation, and they have that little monitor attached to their ankle, right? Well, that ankle monitor has a distance that it can go. And if that person who's wearing that ankle monitor goes past that boundary, it alerts law enforcement. Law enforcement will come and lock you up. They'll come and get you. Now, and I have seen this because I used to work in the system. I used to work at a halfway house, and I used to work next to the individuals who were responsible for putting felons on the box. They would go to a map, a digital map, and they could basically draw a line, or a circle rather, around the property where that person lived. And they had to stay within those boundaries or they faced being locked up. They could also set curfew that they weren't allowed to even be outside. And if they were outside, they were subject to being incarcerated again, breaking the agreement for following the mandates of wearing the box or the monitor on their leg. So now this e-carceration, they are corralling us back into our neighborhoods. Many of us, instead of putting us in prison, they put us back in our neighborhoods with an ankle monitor on our leg and circle the hood and say, you can't come out. So now they are turning areas where we live into digital prisons. Digital prisons. And if you come outside when it's not your time, or if you're not allowed, or if you don't have an agreement that you can work and you have to be home by a certain time, or whatever the case may be, you going back to jail, brother or sister. You going back to jail. So now they're letting us out of the physical prison, out of the physical walls, and they've turned our communities into digital prisons. So again, racism does not end. It does not stop the attempt to produce uneven outcomes and to relegate people of color into the system and make them lesser than other groups. Hasn't stopped. It basically just changes its application. It changes form. Racism, systemic oppression changes to fit the time and era that you happen to be in. Whatever the call, like now we're in this woke, sort of liberal, justice, social justice type of situation. So those who are the engineers and the guiders of status quo and maintaining the status quo, they basically just put their heads together and say, how do we maintain this? And they come up with creative ways to maintain, while it gives the impression that they're trying to do better. Yeah, they let people of color out of prison for low-level crimes and then slap an ankle monitor on them, lock them in their neighborhood, and you can't come out. And if you come out, you're going back to prison. Justified and legal. See how the game is played? And it doesn't matter if it's in the North or in the South. Systemic oppression is interwoven into the fabric of this society, and it is what it is. And that definitely affects Muslims as well. It affects Muslims as well, not just the general African-American community. It affects how many of us are coming out of prison right now that are Muslim, that are affected by e-carceration. Can't get to the masjid, maybe. Can't leave your house. It affects the Muslim community as well. So it is an issue that I would encourage everyone to become educated on, because it's going to start hitting harder sooner than later. Also, don't forget education. Education is important. If low-wage jobs are being eliminated, what is going to be left for people to do? There are some jobs that you have to have the human element in it. Some jobs. But those jobs are going to be less and less and less. And that's a problem that I have with capitalism. Capitalism is kind of unbridled capitalism. I've written papers on this for school. Unbridled capitalism is evil. Unbridled capitalism is bad, and it's destructive, and it's not productive for us as your average layman on the street. Unbridled capitalism works for the elites, but even long-term for them. Again, they don't think longitudinally in some issues, especially when it comes to money. They don't think of the long-term effects of what they do. They don't understand that if you eliminate low-wage workers, who is going to buy all of your products? Who's going to shop in the grocery stores? Who's going to go to McDonald's and Burger King and any other fast food restaurant? If you're taking the money out of the people's pockets who patronize these places very often. Anyway, that's a different conversation. I just wanted to make this video instead of typing all this out for, for people and all of that. It's easier for me to just say it on video. And I'm trying to think, is there anything else? No, I guess that's it. Please feel free to comment, share the video if you think what I said is correct. I do encourage everyone to comment, be it good or bad, be it agree or disagree. Comment, because it's through conversation that we come to understanding. You may tell me something that I never thought of, and I say, that's true, and then I have to recant what I said. Or I may be able to tell you something in addition to what you thought that maybe could sway you, to think maybe different about something. So I enjoy the comments. I appreciate the feedback. It helps me to develop what I'm looking at, what I'm thinking about, the things that I am interested in. Right now, one of the projects that I'm working on the concept paper for my dissertation, and the topic of my dissertation is basically how systemic oppression affects the higher learning outcomes of African American Muslims. And I'm using critical race theory, CRT, as my theoretical framework. And that was actually, surprisingly, it was my advisor, who's not even in America. I go to an Islamic university in Malaysia. My advisor was the one who said, hey, you should use critical race theory for this. She's not American. She's not African American. She's not white. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So I'm doing a lot of critical race reading right now. History, application, just reading from the different CRT scholars, how CRT affects African Americans, and then I'm going to narrow it down to the systemic aspect and higher learning outcomes and critical race theory in regards to African American Muslims. So stay tuned for that. Again, feedback, share the video if you like it. The more the merrier. I like to have conversations and hear people's input. All right. I will talk to you all later. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.